So let's continue with our organic compounds. Back to my whiteboard here. If you haven't watched the first lecture for this, please make sure you go back and do that so that you're caught up, and otherwise we will continue. All right, so I've talked about monomers and polymers, talked about carbon. Let's go ahead and talk about the different types of macromolecules that exist. Okay. These are large organic compounds, okay? Macro meaning big. There are 4 types of macromolecules that we'll talk about. We have carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, and lipids. Okay. I'm sure you recognize carbs and proteins. You might recognize lipids as well if you've done exercise science or if you're kind of following diet, nutrition type things. Nucleic acids are DNA and RNA, okay? So these macromolecules are all made out of carbon backbones, we call them, long strings of carbon that have all these different atoms attached to them, usually hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, or other carbon. When you put all of those together, you end up with these more complex organic molecules. So a carbohydrate, which I talked about on the first lecture, it's a bunch of polymers all put together, okay? So we're gonna go over what the different monomers are for each of these. And I can tell you now that I do test pretty heavily on which monomer ends up building which macromolecule, okay? So, sorry, I have an intruder crawling along just out of camera range. What is the intruder doing? Getting a charger? Just getting a charger. Okay, fun, good times. Hashtag working from home. Hashtag, does anybody do hashtags anymore? I don't even know, but whatever. Okay. All right, moving on. So I do test pretty heavily on that. So we're gonna start with carbohydrates. Which I'll abbreviate as carbs from now on, so I don't have to type it out the entire time. But we're gonna start here with carbs, and we're gonna talk about how you build carbs, okay, or how our body does. Carbohydrates come in kind of 3 different levels of complexity, if you will. That first level, or the simplest level, is called a monosaccharide. Mono meaning one. The root SACCH is referring to sugar, so single sugar, one sugar, okay? So a monosaccharide is sugar, and it can't be broken down into something smaller. As far as it can't get down, let me change that. It can't be broken down into a smaller building block, because it can get broken down into atoms, but it can't get broken down into a smaller building block. It's the brick in the wall, if you will, okay? Because we can't break it down anymore, because it's the single brick, this means that this is a monomer, okay? Monomer of sugar. And a sugar is going to be, you know, as we get to the more complex layers, the more complex sugars are polysaccharides. You put the polysaccharide together and you have the food when we're talking about food, okay? Yes, it's monosaccharide, and yes, it's monomer. Remember that monomer is the brick, monosaccharide is what that brick is made out of. And in this case, this is a sugar brick, okay? examples of monosaccharides. We have, where's my list? We've got glucose, fructose, lactose, okay? There are more. I won't go into all of them because we're just going to use these three, but there's a lot more. Glucose is the main form of energy that our body uses, so most of the energy that gets converted in our body is converted from glucose. Fructose is a sweeter version of that. Probably heard of high fructose corn syrup. The structure of fructose makes it taste sweeter than glucose. And then we have galactose, which I'll get back to in a second. Okay. Monosaccharides, right? Now we're going to move up in the world to disaccharides. Di meaning two, okay? So a disaccharide is more complex than a monosaccharide because a disaccharide is two monosaccharides. How do I want to say it? Through what type of reaction, guys, would put two monosaccharides together into a, so that they're a pair rather than two separate ones? What type of reaction from the last lecture would do that? If you said dehydration reaction, you're right. Okay. Examples of our disaccharides. Okay. Let's start with the sugar and milk. Let's do lactose. Lactose is made up of glucose plus, and here comes our galactose. Doesn't it sound intergalactic? It's out of this world. I couldn't help it. Cheesy science joke. Okay, so lactose is a monomer of glucose and a monomer of galactose put together through a dehydration reaction. And that creates the sugar and milk called lactose. Okay. Then we have something called maltose, which you may be familiar with. Maltose is the sugar that's used in malts. So if you get malts instead of shakes, if you like malted milk balls or Whoppers, that distinctive taste is malt. And malt comes from just having two glucose molecules put together. Okay. So malt doesn't have that like super table sugar sweet, at least to me it doesn't. And yet, again, it is still sweet, but it's the fact that you got two glucoses together that kind of give it that distinctive flavor. Speaking of table sugar, we have sucrose. Okay? Sucrose gets its really sweet taste because not only do we have a molecule of glucose, we have fructose as well. Okay? And again, fructose is the one that's going to make it taste sweeter. Okay? So I'm just going to put in parentheses that this one is table sugar. Right? So you put on your Rice Krispies. Does anybody eat Rice Krispies without sugar? I need to know this. I mean, they're good, but you gotta put the sugar on them, right? Isn't that one of the major breakfast groups, sugar? That's for me. Okay. Finally, we get to our most complex level of carbohydrate, and that's a polysaccharide. So we went from mono, one sugar, disaccharides, two sugars, polysaccharides, lots of sugars, okay? Polysaccharides are usually made of endless strings of glucose. Not exactly endless, but pretty close. Long strings of glucose, just all put on top of each other, okay? And again, these strings of glucose are going to be assembled, or these monomers of glucose are assembled through dehydration reactions. Okay, when it comes to polysaccharides, there's a couple of different ones that you need to know, okay? So the first one is called starch. You may be familiar with this. Again, if you think about foods, starch is sugar storage. So if you think about a potato, Potatoes are basically plants that are, whose cells are loaded with starch, okay? So when you consume a potato or something potato related, you're just eating starch. Remember that if starch is a polysaccharide, it's going to break down eventually into just glucose. So if you have dietary restrictions concerning glucose, you have to be really careful about what kind of or how many starches you're consuming, because they break straight down into glucose. Okay, so sugar storage in plants is called starch. In humans and other animals, it's called glycogen. So this is sugar storage in humans and animals. Glycogen is generally stored in the liver, but there's also some that gets stored in the muscles. That's because when it comes to converting sugar to energy, our muscles are doing a lot of the work. And so we've got a quick store of it there so that our muscles can access it really fast. The stuff that's stored in the liver can go through a variety of conversion processes, from glycogen to glucose and back again. Okay, and then finally we have something called cellulose. Cellulose is, again, it's a polysaccharide, and it's actually the most abundant organic compound on Earth. On Earth. Goodness, organic. Why, you ask? I'm gonna tell you. So it is the most abundant organic compound on Earth because it's found in the woody parts and the supportive structures of plants. Okay, so if you go outside right now, anything that is a branch, a trunk, the stem of a flower, the little, the supporting stem in a leaf, stem, I can't think of the word for it right now, but anyway, all of that is made out of cellulose. So you can see why that's going to be the most abundant organic compound that there is, because it's literally everywhere. Okay. Fun fact, we can't digest cellulose. Most organisms on Earth can't digest it. Wait, what about all the grazing animals, you ask? Yeah, they're actually not digesting the cellulose themselves. The stomachs of ruminating animals, ones that eat and digest greens, they actually have a ton of bacteria in their guts, and it's the bacteria that is producing, or I'm sorry, that is digesting the cellulose, okay? So it's the fact that they have this bacteria in their stomachs that allows cellulose to get broken down. The bacteria release the waste from that process as methane gas, okay? What is methane? Do we remember from the last lecture? Okay, it's a hydrocarbon, right? And so it's one of the things, like some of the extreme things that I've heard about reducing environmental pollution is not have as many cows, right? Because cows produce methane gas as a byproduct of eating grass, or as we now know, the bacteria in their stomachs produce it. So if you have less cows, you have less methane production, and the environment is better. That's really extreme and not based off of enough science to be accurate. So if you've heard that one, don't fall into that trap. Okay, so animals, unless you do eat grass, it's my dog, have bacteria in their guts. Use waste as, I'm going to use chemical formula here, CH4. Okay. Methane. Another thing that humans do eat regularly, well, depending on the person, I guess. Corn. So that outer little slippery cover of corn is made out of cellulose. You don't digest it. We don't digest it. So if you eat corn, that part of the corn passes straight through your digestive tract undigested. Okay. Cellulose in your diet is considered fiber. So if something is high fiber, or like Metamucil that has fiber for your digestive tract, it's cellulose. Because your digestive tract can't break it down, it actually kind of acts like, I don't want to say sandpaper, but it acts as roughage that literally kind of scrapes the walls of your intestines clean as it passes through, because it can't be digested. Fun. Aren't you excited to know that now? I just know you are. Okay, let's talk about proteins. Proteins, we don't have all of these little subcategories for proteins, just some basic vocabulary. Proteins have amino acids that they're built from. If that's the case, and the amino acid is the brick, then amino acids are the monomers for proteins. So in the example for carbs, a single block or a single brick was sugar. It was a monosaccharide. For proteins, that single brick is an amino acid. Okay. When you link amino acids together through dehydration reactions, you eventually get proteins. But before you get to proteins, you get to something called polypeptide. There's that word poly again, meaning many or several, and peptide usually referring to something happening with a protein. So a polypeptide is when you get long strings of amino acids for the complete protein. Proteins actually have a couple of intermediate steps. We're not going to go into them, but they have a couple of intermediate steps before they are a finished and fully functioning protein. So when you have long strings of amino acids, it's a polypeptide. Polypeptides are, actually, I'll do it this way. Amino acids are held together through a special type of covalent bond called a peptide bond. Okay, so it's a special type of covalent bond that holds these amino acids together, but they're called peptide bonds. And so when you hear that term, you know we're talking about amino acids, okay? Not just any covalent bond, you know, in some other compound. We're talking about amino acids. Okay, so this is kind of how I do this one. Let me switch to my pen. No. Okay. All right. So amino acids. How do I usually draw this? Like I'm like, I don't remember. Okay. So we've got 20 different types of amino acids. So I'm just going to draw them as shapes. Okay. So these, Oakley, hey, stop it. These right here, right? These are our peptide bonds holding our amino acids together, all right? And then this whole thing would be a polypeptide. When you put a bunch of polypeptides together, then you end up eventually with a completed protein. Obviously, Polypeptides are going to have way more amino acids than I drew right here, but we're going to pretend. Okay, so we've got our amino acids, we have our polypeptides, we have our peptide bonds. So I think I've talked about just about everything here. Although I do want to say that amino acids, there are 20 different amino acids. Okay, 20 different amino acids. This will become important a little bit further down the road when we start talking about genetics and building proteins. All right, I'm going to pause the lecture again here. We've got 2 more macromolecules to go. We're almost done. Hang in, and I'll see you in a minute.